I'm Bob Riggio. With me is Judge Michael O'Connor, a Marine veteran during the Vietnam era. And again, New Center One, what we like to do is honor our veterans, honor their service. And by doing that, we would like them to tell some stories that they may have to pass on to you folks at home. And I've been talking to Michael off camera, and he has a number of stories. But first of all, Michael, tell us how you got into the Marines and why did you get into the Marines?
Well, when I went to college, we had an ROTC program at the college.
And which college was this?
The University of Santa Clara. It's in California. It's just about 4 miles north of San Jose, California. Okay. And you may have heard of Silicon Valley. It was the middle of it. Anyway, so the first 2 years you were there, you had to do ROTC. And so I saw all these guys who were going to become Army officers, you know, when they graduated.
It sounded pretty good, didn't it, to become an officer?
Yeah, I like the officer part. Didn't like the idea of these guys, which I knew were quite well bossing me around or doing stuff. So I said, well, what else could I do? My dad had been in the Navy, but he was a Marine corpsman during World War II. Okay. And so I looked around, and next thing I knew, I had been up in, or I was up in San Francisco, and I had done my applications, passed the physical, and I found myself raising my right paw in the air and getting sworn in.
So let's remind the folks, back then, the draft was in effect.
Yes.
So once you graduated from college, you were eligible for the draft.
Yes, you were. Yes, you were at the time. And at that time, that was in 1962, and there were just a few little things going on over in Vietnam. Not much, you know, if you had to kind of really look to find out about it, but I had a kind of a feeling it was going to get worse. And so I didn't want to get drafted. I went over there in '67. I was in Western Pacific for 13 months. I was only in Vietnam for 9 months, in country for 9 months. And I spent a lot of that time on what they call a special landing force. This was basically a reinforced infantry battalion with 2 artillery batteries and other attachments floating offshore. So whenever they needed someone to go to shore to help out, we went in. The training we had to prepare us to go over there was preparing to do infantry work. We worked with simulated Vietnamese villages and all the sort of things they had run into.
And where was that training, in California?
No, that was in Quantico, Virginia. We did that going through Officer Basic School for 5 months, because Officer Basic School in the Marine Corps got everyone ready to be an infantry platoon commander. Everybody coming out of there was an infantry platoon commander. Then you went on to any specialized schools if you went into a different area. And I went to artillery, so I went to Fort Sill, Oklahoma, to the Army Artillery School. That's where they sent Marine officers at that time to get their training.
When you arrived in Vietnam, was it everything you expected it to be?
Well, when I arrived, no, it was at a big base in Da Nang. But when we got out in the countryside, yeah, it really was. When we went on some of the operations off this floating force, you know, we were out on Amtraks going across country. You know, we'd set up our battery, you know, right on the edge of a little tiny village or things like that. I was on top of an Amtrak once, and you know, I was doing map reading. I probably shouldn't have been up there so much, but anyway, some guy with a machine gun, I don't know, hundreds of yards away, started doing a few pot shots, and so rounds went over my head, so I kind of did a kip off the side, but that was about as close as I ever got to being shot by a small arm. But I can't tell you what bullets going near you sound like.
You heard the bullets going by.
Yeah. Wow. We were going across a very flat area, and I had to keep track of where we were at all times, which is very difficult to do on our topographical map because there were hardly any contour lines on it. So I was just sort of dead reckoning where we were. The idea for that was if we ever got in trouble and needed to set up the battery very quickly to shoot, we had to have a rough idea where we were. Yeah. That would help.
That helps.
That helps. You don't necessarily have to, but yes, helps if you do that. So I was just trying to figure out where we were most of the time, and that was enough of a chore for me.
So your thoughts were not so much getting shot at or getting hurt. Your thoughts were pretty much just doing the job. Let's just get the job done.
After most of the time I spent was up in what we called I Corps, which was northern South Vietnam, and most of that time I spent was within anywhere from a mile and a half to 10 miles of the North Vietnamese border. Came time for me and I guess other folks to go on R&R, and we were going to go to Australia, so that sounded like fun. Yeah. And so there were 4 of us that were sent down, and 3 officers and this 1 staff sergeant. And so we went down.
Now this is G-rated now, right,
oh, yeah.
Michael?
Yeah, it's G-rated. We went to Da Nang, and the Navy had a nice officers club called the White Elephant. And so we said, well, let's go there. And of course the sergeant says, well, I can't go. And we said, oh yeah, you can. So one of us pulled out an extra set of lieutenant bars and pinned those on his collar. So all 4 of us.
All of you went.
alleged lieutenants went. We walked in the door, and we were met by young Vietnamese ladies who were the hostesses, and they got all excited. And I said, well, what's this? And they said, you have to take your weapons off. You have to leave your weapons here. And, well, we didn't have our weapons on, and then we remembered, oh, yeah, we have our pistols on. We didn't consider those too much of a weapon. So we stored those. And then we went in, and so we're sitting inside having a few drinks, and pretty soon everybody gets up, and they're starting to run out the back door. And one of them stops at our table and says, come on, let's go. And I said, where are you going? We're under a rocket attack. We've got to go to the bunker. And so we said, just a minute. And we went, listen. Where's the rocket attack? They said, over by the airport. It's about 2 miles away. We said, we're going to finish our drinks. You guys go ahead. We figured if we couldn't hear anything, we weren't going to be too worried about it. Once I was on top of a peak, a mountain. It was pretty sharp though, and we were up on top of that. And I remember looking down, maybe about 500 yards away, there was another smaller peak about half as high as we were, with a lot of clear rock on top. And I said to the guy next to me, I said, look at all those rock apes down there, those monkeys. We had a lot of rock apes around. And so then I picked up my binoculars and I looked at the rock apes. And I said, you know, those rock apes are wearing khaki uniforms and they're wearing pith helmets. So we got a fire mission called, but that was not rock apes. And North Vietnamese are regular soldiers.
No. Let me ask you this. What was your mission? I mean, you were in the front lines. You would have a forward observer telling you where to shoot your artillery, yes. Correct?
Yeah.
And you had the infantry with you as well. Were you advancing, or were you just holding your position, or
the only time we advanced was a couple of times. That one time when we went on the sweep across, going across the terrain. The whole battalion was in a sweep, and when it was moving, the rest of the time our battery would pick one spot, and we would stay there. And then people would call in fire missions from wherever they were all around us, and we would respond. We would then do the fire missions.
What kind of artillery did we have? What kind of cannons did you have? And how difficult was it to move those cannons through the marsh and through the swamps of Vietnam?
Didn't move them through marshes and swamps. We were, you might say, usually in the rear with the gear, is an expression, because our artillery is not on the front line with infantry. You're in support. The first unit I was in was, we called it a whiskey battery. It was a 107 millimeter mortar, and it fired a shell about the size, just a hair bigger than a 105 howitzer would. They were called portable. I would call them transportable, because the whole mortar weighed about 900 pounds, but it broke down into different spots. So you could kind of lug it around with a lot of people, but pretty much we just landed, took them off of helicopters and things and set them up. So that's what I was with most of the time, was with this, we called it a whiskey battery. Well, I went to Vietnam as a second lieutenant, and while I was on Okinawa, I made first lieutenant, and then captain later when I came back.
Arriving in Vietnam, it was pretty much what you were expecting.
Pretty much, yeah.
How did you feel leaving Vietnam?
Happy. I was excited.
Happy.
We're going home. Yeah. So yeah, we were all happy to come home.
And how were you received when you got home?
Just fine. I went to Camp Pendleton. the Marines were there. Yeah, I went to a Marine base. Well, one thing you asked about earlier was what did we feel about the war once we got back? And my experience was, and I think a lot of fellows I talked to had the same feeling, and that was, they didn't like the micromanaging coming out of Washington. Our feeling was, okay, you've thrown us into this war, now let us get after it.
Sure.
And let us do what you have to do to get it done, or get us out of here. Mm-hmm. So that was what most of the folks I felt. Yeah.
Okay, anything else?
No, not so much, but thank you, Bob, for doing all this stuff that you do.
Michael, thank you for telling your stories. We really appreciate it.
Well, thanks for the opportunity.